Good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome, appraisers. I'm Bryan Reynolds with Appraiser eLearning, and you are participating in the Appraisal Report Webinar, again brought to you by the fine folks of Appraiser eLearning. And listen, we're really excited that we have a new sponsor, Jim.
How you
So,
doing,
hey, Jim,
Bryan?
how are you this morning?
I'm doing great. Yeah, we're really excited to have LIA as a sponsor. We're going to be talking about staying off the naughty list, what to do when you get a complaint, and who better to have as a sponsor than an E&O insurance company. So we're really excited to have them on as a sponsor for this.
Absolutely. Thank you, LI Administrators and Insurance. We certainly appreciate your support of the Appraisal Report webinar. So, guys, we're super excited. Now, just a reminder, we've been a little tardy. We've taken a few months off. The Appraisal Report webinar normally comes to you monthly. It's free of charge, so the price is right. It's normally the fourth Thursday of every month. Of course, for November, December, we have to massage those dates a little bit. It's normally at 10 o'clock Central Standard Time. And the cool thing about it is you get to participate. You have the ability to type in your questions live, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. So don't be shy. We do just ask that you be kind, be respectful, and be professional. Hard questions are okay. Hard questions are welcome, right? That makes the discussion a little bit more interesting, and that's what we do for a living, guys. We're problem solvers. So let's try and solve a problem together if we can possibly do that. That being said, if you can only watch part of this and you got to go do an inspection or something, these are all recorded and they live on our YouTube channel. So you're watching us via YouTube right now, we would ask that you go ahead and hit the subscribe button, because occasionally we'll have special edition broadcast. And the best way for you to be informed of those is to be a subscriber on our YouTube channel. So take a couple of seconds and hit that subscribe button. You'll be glad you did. Now, on to the guest. I'm so excited. Jeff Morley was gracious enough to be on a podcast recently, and we had a good time. We were talking about complaints and how to avoid complaints, what to do if you get one. And it was just a conversation that needed more than 20 or 30 minutes. Jeff Morley is the chair of the Utah Appraisers and Licensing and Certification Board. He's a certified general appraiser out of the state of Utah and just an all-around great guy. Jeff, welcome. We're glad you're joining us again.
Boy, excited to be here, Bryan, and grateful for the invite to come back. Picking this back up, I question your judgment a little bit, using me as the guest to kick off after a couple of month hiatus, but excited to be here, and certainly a lot I think we can pick up on from our last conversation.
You know, Jeff, you're too modest, but I tell you what, one of the reasons that I reached out to you, and I think I bumped into you at maybe, was it Arrow that we or a conference? I don't know. I bumped into you somewhere, and we were sitting in the back, and I think had a conversation about this. And I'll tell you, one of the things that prompted me to talk to you, to invite you to have this topic, I had a couple of different folks say, wouldn't it be nice if a regulator would sit down and tell the practicing appraiser what are some of the common things they see, and maybe as a practitioner, maybe as an appraiser, if you had done things just a little bit differently, your outcome would have been differently. And this person was saying it would be wonderful. And I said, yeah, I've asked regulators in the past, and I've asked investigators in the past for regulatory boards, and they've all pushed back and have not either been able to or willing to, or maybe both. And you right away said, yeah, I would be excited to do that. So thank you for doing that. And I think the appraisers out there should be grateful for you doing this, because this doesn't occur very often. So thank you for your time here. So let's dive right into the topic, and I'm going to let you take lead on this. I know you've got a little PowerPoint presentation for a reference, so if you want to use that, however you want to do it, Jeff, the floor is yours.
Well, Bryan, I really appreciate it, and it's probably worth noting as we get going that I'm very happy to share perspectives and insight. I think for a lot of us as appraisers, the regulatory process, those involved with regulation, we don't have as great or as clear of an understanding of what that process is. What do people, what are they looking at when a complaint is filed? And certainly to the point you made, what can I do proactively to avoid problems or issues when a complaint is filed? I think just are very valuable perspectives for the appraisers, and certainly something I didn't understand or appreciate until I was given the opportunity to participate in our board. I'm in my 8th year of being on our appraiser licensing and certification board, and will complete my term middle of next year, I think. And so I've gained a lot of perspective just as to how this whole process plays out. And I didn't really understand or appreciate fully what the process is, what might trigger a complaint, what can appraisers be doing proactively to avoid the complaints in the first place, to be as prepared as possible if something does come up, and then how to go about it. If a complaint is filed, what are some do's and some don'ts as far as managing that process well. I thought of an analogy, and Bryan, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but you ride motorcycles a little bit, don't you?
No, I try not to. I have, but I try not to.
Try not to. Well, there's probably some wisdom in that. I enjoy and don't ride as much as I would like to, but one of the things, especially as a motorcyclist out on the roads, that I think preserves longevity is defensive driving, being aware of what's going on around you, assuming that something on the road, a driver or something may do something unexpected, and a bad situation might come up. What will I do if that car pulls out in front of me that I'm not anticipating? And as I thought about this topic specifically, I think there's a lot that appraisers can do to be defensive drivers in a sense, meaning that if you're proactive and as prepared as possible, I think you set yourself up to minimize the risk in the first place of a complaint being filed. And secondarily, even if a complaint does get filed, you're prepared as possible to defend or have a strong case there. One of the things I think that would be interesting to dive into as we kick this conversation off is the complaint process initially, because as you know, and I suspect many of the listeners do, the way that the state boards work is they will respond to a complaint when a complaint comes. They don't automatically go out and audit every appraiser's files every year to check for compliance. It's really a complaint-driven or based kind of enforcement process. And that may be good, may be bad. I don't know that I necessarily want to be handing over reports every year for the state to look at, if I didn't have to on the one hand. But on the other, there's not a lot of limitations on who can file a complaint at the state initially. There are a number of classes or categories of either users or people that end up with access to an appraisal, whether they're actually an intended user or not. I think we've all dealt with or seen the real estate agents that we do an appraisal on a transaction they're involved with. They're not happy with the result for whatever reason. Those can be a source of a complaint that's turned into the state. And oftentimes in that scenario, their motivation is value driven, and it's oftentimes whatever your opinion isn't facilitating this deal. Usually it's you're too low and I think it should be higher, and you're messing up my deal and my transaction. Right. So they've got a motivation in the transaction. Oftentimes that's why they're unhappy if they're going to be. But, obviously we'll have homeowners, buyers, sellers that are parties to that transaction as well. And if you're doing an appraisal for a lending institution, the intended user and the intended use is for originating a loan. It's for your lender client. These aren't necessarily clients of yours, but they are those that end up with copies of the appraisal and may not be happy with the results. And there's nothing that prohibits them from turning something like that into the state. Now, interestingly, there are other users of the reports that will get them. Oftentimes when the loan is originated, it will be packaged and then sold to one of the government sponsored enterprises, the GSEs, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They will review appraisals and sometimes even have concerns, depending on the quality of the appraisal. And not always, but I know that they have some concerns on the reverse side of overvaluation concerns. So if I complete an appraisal and the parties to the transaction are happy, but the GSEs look at it and think that there's data that say that, well, hey, maybe that value is too high, that can trigger a complaint as well. On the, so at first glance, it feels like the appraiser's in kind of an unfair situation where, I may have multiple parties looking at an appraisal with different motivations or reasons for using or relying on that appraisal. I can get turned in if it's perceived to be too high. I can get turned if it's perceived to be too low. So what is the appraiser to do? That's what we'll dive into, I think, in helping to prevent those, or at least minimize the risk of a complaint being filed, but then also being as prepared to defend yourself as possible. There were a couple of other users I think worth noting. HUD is also another one who may have overvaluation concerns, but they also are worried about compliance. Has the appraiser appropriately identified compliance of the property with their 4000.1? HUD has been overseeing some discrimination complaints and investigations, and so there are multiple reasons why they might be investigating appraisal and potentially referring that on to the state as well. And really, the long and short of it is anybody that ends up with a copy of the appraisal can turn it into the state. Now, what the state does once they have it is will vary a little bit from state to state. Oftentimes, there's a kind of a screening process or whatnot. But any of those things can trigger a complaint or a referral to the state, basically, for investigation there.
Yeah, and let's expand on a couple of those bulleted items, right? Some of these things you can only do so much to protect. You mentioned defensive driving, and I love that analogy. That's wonderful. I might borrow that sometime if you don't mind. I wrote a course probably 7 years ago, and it's an appraiser's guide to CYA, covering your appraisal or whatever you want to call it, right? And it's exactly what you're talking about. Trying to be defensive, taking defensive appraisal practices, I guess, if you want to call it that, and making sure that you comply with the minimum reporting requirements of USPEP, guys. And appraisers can help avoid hot water by doing just that. Open up that USPEP book and get your appraisal report and grade yourself. Go through that appraisal report. Make sure that it complies with Standard Rule 22A, right? It either does or it doesn't. That's not ambiguous. That's not subjective. It either does or doesn't. You either have checked off all of those items or you haven't. It's just that simple. And if you haven't, there's not a lot of defense there. So first of all, grade yourself. Do that yesterday. But let me ask you a couple of questions with this. Fannie, a representative from Fannie had reached out to me and knew we were doing this program today. Mm-hmm. And they said, simple, you don't want to get in trouble with Fannie Mae, don't overvalue the property. And I bet some appraisers out there would argue that they're doing more than just that, right? Fannie Mae's taking a closer look. But ultimately, that was the comment from that representative. But let me ask you about this. You mentioned a real estate agent, they lose they lose a commission in their mind. They lost it because of the appraiser, or the homeowner is not able to close on that loan for their refinance. And maybe they were going to do a cash out, Jeff, and go to Disney World or something, right? And now that bad appraiser, because they didn't know what they were doing, has prevented me from getting this cash out refi money. And so I'm going to call the appraiser and talk to him about it, discuss it. I have seen in some of my consulting with appraisers get in trouble, many appraisers that won't even call them back. Now, their argument is, well, I can't talk to them if I do call them back, so I just don't call them back. What is your recommendation for that? We're talking about defensive, right? If somebody calls you and you never call them back and they want to talk to you because they're disgruntled about your value opinion, that's probably gonna make them more mad. So how can you do that defensive driving technique with either a consumer or a real estate agent, like you mentioned, a sales agent, a builder, whomever's mad when they want to call and talk to you about the appraisal?
Boy, that is such a good question, Bryan, and very much on the mind of one of the things I wanted to address today, because Certainly in USPAP, we have a duty of confidentiality of assignment results, to our client. But within that framework, it does not prevent us from at least having appropriate levels of communication with anybody that may be a party to the transaction. Now, certainly there are inappropriate levels of communication or whatnot, but one of the things I found, and in fact, one of the notes that I've got here is that good, call it bedside manner, tends to defray or prevent a complaint being filed as much as anything else. I listened to a study a while back, and that concluded that in the medical profession, that the surgeons that tended to have the highest incident of malpractice lawsuits were the ones with poor bedside manner, not necessarily the ones that were the least skilled, or left their scalpels in people, or screwed up surgeries, cut on the wrong knee or whatever. But the ones that were at least proactive in addressing a concern. All of us are human, and it's possible that there may be something we should look introspectively at or correct in an appraisal. More often than not, it's a value-related concern, and it wouldn't be appropriate to be discussing that either without the client's permission. But in the lending world, there's an established reconsideration of value process, and so there's a world of difference between saying, "Nope, I can't talk to you, so I'm not going to talk to you," and look, I've got limitations and I've got a responsibility to my client, but here's how we can go about getting additional data considered. Here's how we can go about having your concerns addressed in a way that's appropriate and above board and consistent with, appraiser independence requirements and all of the things that, that as appraisers, we want to do a good job with. And what I find is that most appraisers are well-intentioned in trying to have appropriate communications, that they don't want to be perceived as, disclosing confidential assignment results or violating USPAP in any other way.
Right.
And so it can certainly be done, but you can avoid a lot of those frustrations. I think you made a good point, Bryan, that if they're unhappy with the result and then you're unwilling to talk to them, it's kind of a double whammy. And so they feel like,
they get infuriated. Yeah. Absolutely. The guy won't even call. I'm calling to find out why Jeff appraised my house for $200 when I know it's got to be worth, at least $300, and he won't even call me back. So, and it makes it suspect that maybe you did do something wrong, or you did have bad behavior. Or you're at least being unprofessional and not returning my phone call. And those property owners don't realize they're not your client and that you're bound by confidentiality. They don't know that.
Yep.
All they know is they didn't get the number that they thought their house was worth. You're the one that did it, and you won't even call them back to discuss it. And then if you do call back and say, "Sorry, can't talk to you, bye," and they're like, "Well, wait, I paid for it." So I think you need to have a conversation. Say, "I'm sorry, I understand you paid for it, but that doesn't make you a client." Right? Mm-hmm. There's things we can talk about and things we can't. But you brought up an excellent point just now that I haven't done. I haven't thought. I mean, we have in a roundabout way. But are you suggesting that the appraiser, when they find themselves in that situation, I mean, we can talk to them about the process. We can talk to them about physical characteristics. Right? They think you got something wrong there. Why would you not want to talk to them? I had an attorney in Nashville recently call me and said the seller of the property feels strongly that the appraiser got the square footage wrong. And the appraiser won't even call him back. Finally called back and said, "Well, you're not my client. Can't talk to you." And it's a physical characteristic. And if you're an appraiser, wouldn't you want to know that their argument is something that maybe you did get wrong? Maybe you should run back out there and measure it real quick and make sure, right? But they finally worked through that. But my point is, we can't talk to them about the value opinion. We can't talk to them about the opinion of highest and best use. And we can't talk to them about highest and best use results, right? Unless we have permission from the client. But what I think I'm hearing you say is maybe you advise that consumer about the ROV process, recertification, request for reconsideration. That's what I'm talking about. You're talking about explain that process. Hey, the process is that you go through your contact at the lender, send them additional data to support your opinion. They'll send it to me, and we'll go from there. Is that what you're suggesting the appraisers do?
I personally think that's the best practice, yeah, Brian. I'm an appraiser. I don't love getting the ROVs when you've already done the work and they come back with data that's not relevant. I'm not saying that that's always an appraiser's desired outcome, but there is a world of difference, and I firmly believe that you are far less likely to have somebody file a complaint to the state if you will at least engage with them, explain the process, and offer them an avenue to have their concerns heard, as opposed to not. Because if you don't, what else is left to them? I would far rather go through an ROV process with a lender than a complaint at the state if it comes down to that. And I think sometimes it does.
It'd be a whole lot cheaper, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and a lot less stressful.
Well, that's a great tip. I mean, thank you for that. And appraisers, you need to listen to that. So you got a disgruntled party. Instead of not calling them back, and I get it, nobody wants to call somebody and have them yell at them. I get it, but you can premise that, hey, I'm calling you back. You asked for my call. I'm calling you back. Don't yell at me. I know you're frustrated, but let's talk about this like adults and figure it out. And then, hey, there's a process. If you think we missed something, if you think the value is higher than what I opined, here's a course of action. And I welcome that. I'm happy to take a second look at it, but there's proper channels. You got to go through the proper channels. Unfortunately, the proper channel isn't for you to call me and us talk about it and boom, I changed the number. Here's the proper channel. So if you want us to reconsider this is the avenue. And I think the profession as a whole, Jeff, is working on some processes like that to maybe make that kind of a best practice for appraisers and some standards with that, instead of, everybody doing different things. I know VA has the Tidewater initiative, and it's a very similar issue as to what we're talking about. So it's a great tip. Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Jim, you can pull that PowerPoint back up if you want. We'll keep rocking.
Very good. Well, and maybe as we move forward, Brian, it's worth noting that oftentimes the source or the reason that the complaint is sent into the state in the first place is value-based. Whenever there's action taken, in my time on the board, I have yet to see the primary reason for the action taken is you got the value wrong, you got the number wrong. It is akin to that driving analogy again, where it's far easier for a policeman to issue a citation for speeding or failing to stop than it is for law enforcement to prove, criminal intent on homicide or something. Technical violations are usually where the appraiser, if they're going to have a problem with the state, is what the end result is, even though the complaint initially going in was, homeowner, agent, somebody else didn't like the value, the conclusion of the report. But by the time the state goes in and investigates, they're looking for compliance with, if you're doing real property, standards 1 and 2 of, did I develop the assignment, and then did I report it appropriately and check those boxes? And if a property sold within the last 3 years and I didn't disclose it, if I have some other reporting deficiency, those are relatively easy things to get an appraiser on, or I don't even like saying it that way, I guess, but those are easy things to prove from the investigator's perspective, that, hey, you were supposed to do it, didn't do it, it's not here. It's pretty cut and dry.
Yeah, that's the factual stuff that we were talking about a moment ago. I mean, that's the items that are listed in the reporting requirements, and for the appraisers watching, the reporting requirements are in Standards Rule 2. So that's why I said go through Standard Rule 2.2a. That's to Jeff's point. If the subject property sold within the last 3 years and you didn't put it in your report, that's pretty black and white. I mean, it's kind of hard for you as an appraiser to defend yourself that you didn't do anything wrong when you did do something wrong. So good stuff.
Absolutely. Well, and so we had a case that is somewhat illustrative, I think, of what we're talking about here, Brian, where, and this all could have been avoided. And frankly, I mean, I'm glad that it came to light, but it probably could have continued to skirt under the radar. But we had a situation a number of years ago where an appraiser had a trainee. The appraiser was, sending the trainee out to do inspections. The appraiser was signing on the left certification that they had been the one inspecting the property when they hadn't. And the state never would have known, this never would have come to to light, except that a complaint got turned in. And the reason that the complaint got turned in is a homeowner had, if I remember correctly, had spent thousands of dollars, I don't remember the exact figure, putting a brand new deck on the back of their house. The trainee goes out, does the inspection, the report gets signed inappropriately, turned into the lender. The homeowner is then unhappy with the value. The refinance isn't going to work in this case. Calls the appraiser to talk about it. And if I remember the facts correctly, it's been a while, but I believe what happened was when they called in, they got the trainee that had answered, and the trainee basically said something to the effect that, oh, well, the appraiser doesn't give any value for decks. You know, the homeowner's asking about, well, what about these thousands of dollars I spent on this deck? And the answer, simply was, well, they just don't give value for that.
Oh, ouch.
Homeowner's unhappy, well, okay, now what do I do? I guess I can, another recourse is turn it into the state. And so through the course of this process, it becomes discovered that this was a pattern with that appraiser. There was pretty severe, punishment levied at the end of the day. And really, it all stemmed to this one conversation of a homeowner calling in, wanting to talk to the appraiser, and there just not being helpful communication. Now, like I say, at the end of the day, I'm glad that it came to light, because what was being done was inappropriate, and it's the job of the state and the board to enforce the rules when somebody's clearly skirting them. But
Right.
it all stemmed back to that one conversation, and probably could have been avoided, may have gone on longer than it should, had that conversation simply gone differently with the homeowner.
Yeah, and I hear that a lot. I've got some pet peeves, right? I talk about, well, here's a copy of the appraisal. I'm done with it, and this is not the appraisal, ladies and gentlemen. This is the appraisal report. It's the method in which we're communicating the results of the appraisal to the client. The appraisal and the appraisal report are two different things. So, when I hear an appraiser say, well, I didn't give that pool any value or I didn't give the deck any value. Guys, we never give anything value. We don't have the power to give value. We're reporters, we're investigators, and we're reporters. We're investigating the actions of market participants, and we're reporting the results of that analysis of the actions of market participants. If the market participants are paying more for that deck or that amenity, then we're figuring that out through our analysis of their actions, and then we're communicating those results. We don't ever give value. So extract that completely from your vocabulary. And to Jeff's point, this person got in kind of hot water, but primarily for that reason, if I'm hearing you right.
Yeah, absolutely. And the main, what the investigation revealed were underlying problems with, the way the inspections were taking place and all of that. But I put that in parentheses. I'm glad you focused in on that, Bryan, because that was, and now this was communication coming from a trainee who was new in the process and, just didn't know any better than I think to communicate it the way that they did. But absolutely worth emphasizing that, we analyze and report what's going on out there, and, we're not bestowing value on these amenities or whatever. And frankly, one of the concerns I've heard both or representatives from both of the GSEs talk about is, if anything, appraisers chronically under-adjust for some of the features that they have data for, suggesting that things like GLA should probably be adjusted at a higher rate than what many appraisers, end up doing or are comfortable doing, because I've just always adjusted in this range. And even though the market's doubled in the last, 4 or 5 years, my GLA adjustment or whatever else is still the same rate I was using 4 or 5 years ago. And so we need to be as proactive as we can as appraisers. And that it's certainly one of the best practices is, we need to be reporting the market based on market data, and not just what's been comfortable for the last 2 or 3 decades that we've been doing this, because markets shift, and we need to be able to reflect that as appropriately as they do.
I know one incident, because the practicing appraiser had reached out for me for help. And she said, she was almost in tears, Jeff. And she said, I didn't. This is just how I was trained. She got a letter from Fannie Mae, and this has been a long time ago because I think this is in my CYA course actually. So it's been a long time ago, and she got a letter, and they had a column of sales that she had used or a property she had appraised over the last, I don't know, 6 months or whatever. And they just had, I don't know, 20 or 30 listed, but apparently she did this every day. And it didn't matter if it was, and she was nice enough to let me use this in a classroom. I mean, I obviously redacted her name. We're not going to embarrass somebody like that, but she was nice enough to say, hey, I've learned from this. And if other appraisers can learn from it, Bryan, have at it. So I had her actual notification from Fannie Mae, redacted her name, address, all that type of thing. But it had line item. Here you appraised a condo at 900 square feet for $200,000 and you adjusted $20 a foot. Here you appraised a 4,500 square foot home. You appraised for $800,000 and you adjusted GLA at $20 a foot. It didn't matter what the property type was, the location it was in, the price point it was in, the size, every adjustment she made ever. And she admitted to this. I did it. $20 a square foot. Right. So your point's well taken, guys. There's many ways to support your opinion of the market's reaction to differences in square footage. Find one of those techniques, right? Use a recognized technique. And then when Jeff says, look, we have questions of how you got this. Where are you basing this $75 a square foot adjustment on? You say, Jeff, I'm glad you asked that. This is my support for why I did what I did. And they may ultimately say, well, we don't agree with that, but at least you have something. Jeff, in those instances, like we're talking about right now, square footage differences, if an appraiser were to provide you something, right? Here's my paired sales analysis. Here's regression analysis, and it gave me this, and I opined this. What would typically the outcome be of that conversation?
Check the box and move on. I mean, it provided that the explanation is reasonable, is based on, recognized techniques, like you say, Bryan. But in that case, and for better or worse, I almost anymore look at the cases that we have, and obviously you have to understand that these are the problems. Like there's kind of an established issue already before, as they come to the board. So it's not like we're seeing, and I'm not implying that all appraisers are doing this, but when there's a problem, these are the kinds of things that tend to come up. And it's like, if they've got some rationale, if you can explain what you've done in an appraisal and why, and there's market support or basis for that, I've never seen anybody ultimately be disciplined or have a negative finding for them, provided that they can do that very thing. We had, and here's another example, we had an experience review with a trainee who was applying to become licensed in the state. She hadn't had great training, which, and I think kind of to your point, the example you had, same situation. And I feel for those people because, you don't know any different as a trainee. You assume that the person that's been doing it for 20 years that's now training you is doing it the way that they should be. And how would you know any different until you have a different perspective?
What my boss told me to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Why would I assume that my boss is wrong, until you have another perspective on it, maybe? And that was very much the situation here. And so, we're going through this experience. Her initial submission of sample reports got denied. So she appealed and was sitting before the board. And so we're just talking through the process. And, I'm not one that tries to be overly aggressive, but I just want to understand, the facts. And does the trainee that is now asking to get licensed, do they understand what they're doing? Can they produce a credible report, or are they a threat to the public's perception of appraisers out there if they go and get licensed or certified? And this really surprised me, Bryan, because we're in this conversation. We're not that far into it. And I just asked, simply, hey, I see that you adjusted your GLA, and I don't remember exactly what the rate was. Can you talk to us a little bit about where that came from, or what your process is for, coming up with a GLA adjustment? I didn't feel like that was, an overly onerous question. Right. And her response, she had been struggling leading up to that point a little bit, but her response caught me off guard. She's like, can we just end this? Can we just be done, like, with this appeal?
She wanted to withdraw the appeal. Is that what you're saying?
She was like, can we just end this? And I was like, I didn't know how to respond. And that hasn't happened very often, in my experience here. And I don't say that in any way to pick on this poor trainee. Sure. But the challenge that she had was that she didn't understand where the GLA adjustment was coming from. It was, my boss told me to do it this way. And so, we went for it. We didn't just end the appeal. We went forward with some suggestions on how to actually, go support it from the market. And then, essentially ended up sending her back to get some additional experience and then reapply. And it wasn't that her career was over or that there was no hope for her ever becoming an appraiser. It was just, right now, you don't meet that minimum threshold. Here's what you need to do to be able to meet it. So, work on that, implement it, come back. And, I don't see myself, as a board member, as a gatekeeper that gets to, tell people whether they're coming in or out, other than that they just need to be able to comply with USPAP. And if they can, then great. And if they can't, then they ought to understand what, where the deficiencies are and be given an opportunity to fix it, in my view.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, thank you for doing it in that manner, because you didn't have to, right? You could have said, where does your support for your GLA adjustment? How'd you get this? And wait for an answer. And if they didn't answer, okay, we're going to deny you and you're done. You didn't do that. You said, they even asked, can this meeting be over? Because I don't want to answer hard questions from you anymore. And your heart kind of goes out to that trainee, and you handled it really in a kind way of saying, okay, here are some suggestions for you. And you guys certainly didn't have to do that, so I admire that. Hey, we need to take a quick break. Jim Morrison, I can't believe time's getting away from us, my friend. We're halfway into this, so we certainly want to thank our sponsor, LIA Administrators and Insurance Services, for supporting and sponsoring the Appraisal Report webinar. Jim?
LIA Administrators and Insurance Services provides E&O insurance with a commitment to superior customer service, outstanding liability education, and unmatched claim defense. Our professional liability program benefits over 10,000 real estate professionals nationwide. Explore our Appraiser Liability Education by Peter Christensen and cost-effective seminars created exclusively for valuation professionals. Our underwriters, each with an average of 26 years of experience, are dedicated to supporting appraisers. Visit liability.com to discover how LIA can safeguard your business. And there's also a link up on everyone's screen, and I think it should click through, but it's liability.com.
Thank you, Jim. Peter Christensen does a great job. Jeff, I know you've heard him speak. He's phenomenal. He's doing some education with us now at Appraiser eLearning, and so we're talking about trying to avoid the complaints we've talked about quite a bit. Defensive driving, as Jeff had mentioned earlier. But sometimes you just can't avoid it. You can't make that disgruntled property owner or real estate agent or whomever happy. And maybe they did do a request for a reconsideration of value, and it didn't help, right? And so they're just heck bent on sending that complaint, so it happens. Hey, before I come back to you, Jeff, Jim, do we have any questions that's come in that we need to? I don't want to miss any of the questions because we run out of time. So
yeah, so this one from William Guion, it's kind of hard to read. That says, what about non-lending assignments? Does the reconsideration of value exist for those?
Great question. Thank you, William, for that question. Jeff?
You bet. So it'll depend a little bit on the circumstances. But if I'm in a non-lending situation, I'm assuming that the ROV or the person that may be unhappy might be the client if I'm doing the appraisal for an individual, and they then have questions about that. If that's the case, if they're your client, of course you can have the candid conversations about the property and the process. If it's not, then the same principle and application would apply. If I've done a non-lending appraisal and somebody other than my client has concerns or thinks that there's something that should be reconsidered, you may need to be a little bit more proactive in reaching out to your client or directing them back to that client. But the principles would apply the very same. And I've had those situations where you take on a non-lending assignment. the client oftentimes expected something different than what the result is, and then talking through, what you did and why. Did that conversation we just had before the break of, not only to the appraisal board, but also to your clients. If you can explain what you did and why, will go a long way there. It's maybe not as formalized of a process as what lenders will have in place, but certainly the principles, certainly are equally applied in a non-lending environment.
Yeah. William, let's propose that you did an appraisal for a homeowner who is thinking about selling their home, right? So the intended use is for your client. Your client is the homeowner. The intended use is for their internal decision-making process relative to potential marketing. And you appraise it and you turn that into that homeowner, and they call you up and say, William, well, come on, dude. What were you thinking? My house is worth a lot more than that, right? So that is kind of a reconsideration of value right there in the works, right? Might not be called that. There's no technical term for that, but it's the similar process. The reconsideration for value from a lender's perspective, there's proper channels to go through. So now you're working for Bank A and you do the appraisal and the homeowner's mad. They need to go through the bank, and then the bank sends you that formal request for reconsideration of value. And there's really no standards out there, or really, I'd argue, Jeff, even best practices as we're sitting here speaking. Each client could have different protocol for that. And that's why I know Freddie Mac's working on this in a task force trying to figure out. I heard Scott Reuter speak just Monday, in fact, or Tuesday, on this very topic. And they're working together trying to figure out, is there a way to do this? And there's some USPAP concerns right now with communicating in advance of your value. So that's another topic, and we've got lots to talk about with Jeff, so I don't want to get off. Jim, do we have any other questions we need to knock out real quick?
So we're going to go on talking about air right now, or there's some questions about the air, and I know that was on our slide. Oops.
Okay.
Receiving data and what constitutes an air violation.
Okay, so yeah, Jeff, talk, first of all, let everybody know what air means. We may have some non-appraisers watching this as well, and some appraisers that may not be familiar with that term. So let's talk about what air is, and then I see you've got a bullet there to review air statement.
Yeah, you bet. So air meaning or standing for the appraiser independence requirement. I believe. Yes.
Yep.
It was just looking that up, and in many of the form softwares for the appraisers, there is a specific addendum or requirement for that specifically. Interestingly, our division director just reached out to me within the last week or two. He's putting together in the newsletter that they send out quarterly a discussion around appraiser independence requirements. What appropriate and inappropriate communication is between agents and appraisers, or anybody else and appraisers. As I took the time to go read through what he was putting together and referencing specifically some of the language in Dodd-Frank, it was a good reminder. And the reason I had that bullet point there is all appraisers have access to that. I wasn't necessarily planning on, reading through it in detail in this setting, but I would encourage appraisers to look through it, because it talks about what's inappropriate communication or influence on an appraiser. But what I found, and my personal feeling, is that if an agent has data that they want the appraiser to consider, I don't see any reason in the world why an appraiser wouldn't consider data that somebody has. To me, that doesn't mean that they're automatically influencing us. I think sometimes appraisers would like to be protected from bad data or from things that maybe aren't helpful in the process. An agent might have information that isn't available otherwise and is very helpful. They might have information that is dissimilar and not worth using. As a practicing appraiser, my perspective is always, I would rather know where they're coming from and what they're thinking based on the data that they have. And then I can, harken back to this defensive driving. I can complete my report in a way that will proactively address some of those concerns. One of the things I found to be incredibly helpful is active listings in the market. If there's an expectation of a value that's higher than what I think the market is supporting. If I can point to a listing or two that is competing out there in the market today that does not support where they think that value ought to be, it's easy to explain, look, I can't appraise this for more than what existing inventory is offered for on the market and not selling for currently. But, so there are things like that you can do, but why would you not want to know what they're thinking or what that data is? I'll have agents hand me packages of comparable sales or whatever. I don't think that's inappropriate influence. I may or may not rely on that data. It's just data until I analyze it and then decide whether it's comparable and worth including in the report or not. I've never seen in our state discipline, handed out because an appraiser accepted data from a party to the transaction. So it was worth noting because I know appraisers get nervous about that. And certainly if somebody's, threatening to withhold work, offering to pay something, offering to give additional work if you can meet this value or something like that, I mean, those are inappropriate, and are appraiser independence requirement violations. I mean, that stuff is inappropriate. But the simple providing of data is not, in my view. And I think appraisers are well served to consider it.
Yeah, you if you're a viewer, you can do a search for AIR or appraiser independent requirements, and you'll get a whole ton of information. Right? There is a frequently asked question on FAMA's website. It's got some good stuff. The very first question is, "Can I talk to a real estate agent?" And the answer is, of course, yes. Right? You could talk to, because there's some practitioners out there that think I can't talk to anybody. Right? Can't talk to the lender. Can't talk to an agent. Can't talk, and that's simply not true. Right? And then what Jeff said, what they can't do is try to pressure you. That is impacting your independence as an appraiser. And I've actually used that to my advantage one time because I had a client call me and they were trying to get me to change an adjustment, two adjustments. Hey, I need you to make that adjustment a little bit less on whatever it was, location, and make that adjustment a little bit higher on car storage. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Well, if you just do this, it'll look better. And you've appraised it slightly over the sale price. So just make those adjustments and then appraise it for the sale price. We'll be good to go and close. I'm like, when you hired me, when you ask me for my opinion, be careful because I'm going to give you my opinion. If I make those adjustments, it's no longer my independent opinion. It's your opinion. You sign the report. And then I finally, what's worked for me many times, Jeff, is when I say, surely you're not trying to impact my independence as an appraiser, are you? So far, guys, I've never had a client come back and say, yeah, Bryan, I'm trying to impact your independence as an appraiser. So it's a pretty good little strategy. It's worked pretty good. All right, Jim, unless we've got any other burning questions, I'll let Jeff get back at it because we have
one just on those adjustments from Catherine Bright. If a thorough explanation of how adjustments are derived is included in the appraisal report, do you consider that necessary or helpful?
Great question. Jeff?
You bet. Well, so my perspective on that is, yes, I think a best practice is to describe where and how the adjustments come from in the report. If it's not in the report or if there's additional support that resides in the work file, that can be appropriate as well. Where I see people have the problem is the lack of that, where there's no support in the work file for where the adjustment came from. It's not addressed in the report as to where that adjustment came from or the market data that support or back that up. That's where you have challenges. In a lending environment, I know that clients like to see where those adjustments are coming from and some level of support for them. So certainly that addresses it if it's in the report. If it's not, then it should at minimum be in the work file.
Definitely in the work file, no question about that. I'll tell you, Catherine, thank you for that question. What we've done, we've just created another network of appraisal offices, and one of my guys who like putting all those specific adjustments, I mean every single one, and we don't typically do that. Now let me give you a scenario where we are definitely going to explain it in detail. Let's say my subject property has an ADU and I couldn't find any comps with an ADU. I mean, I got none. Right? I can't make up a sale, right? So I've got sales, and I'm going to have a single line item adjustment on every one of my comps for my subject having that ADU. I've got a line item adjustment of $50,000 or $80,000, whatever the contribution of the ADU is. Well, I'm probably going to get a call on that, right? How'd you get that adjustment? So what we'll do is we'll be proactive, like Jeff is talking about on that one, because we anticipate rightfully so, someone saying, how'd you get that? Okay, great. Well, let me tell you exactly how to get it. I did a depreciated cost analysis, and here it is, right? I might even put that detailed on that particular one. But at a minimal, have all of that in your work file. So as Jeff said, when you're called, if you're called in front of that board and Jeff says, how'd you get that adjustment for GLA? You're prepared to answer that question. That's the key. Thanks, Jim. All right, Jeff, let's move down the road. We've got about 10, 11, 12 minutes left, and I might keep you over just a couple of more minutes if we could do that. But let's try and get through as much as we can here. It's a great topic.
You bet. Yep. And I'm happy to stay, Bryan, as long as you'd like. One of the things you'd mentioned that I think is just worth emphasizing here is doing some of the work ahead of time, auditing your own files, consulting with somebody. And I'm just speaking from my own experience here, but I've worked with some professionals that offer services where they'll review, critique, and then give you feedback on, random samples that you want to provide, assess your processes, for compliance with USPAP, as far as what are you doing day in and day out? How are you, kind of going about the appraisal process in addition to just the reporting of the appraisal assignments. So those kinds of things, I would far rather have somebody that I'm engaging with give me some feedback that says, hey, you probably should expand here, or hey, you forgot to include this in the report and it should be there. I'd rather have that come from somebody that I'm consulting with than a state investigator because a complaint's been filed because somebody didn't like the value. And though this, technical reporting issue isn't necessarily value, related or impactful in the value, they're still going to look at that as a potential USPAP violation. And so, especially as things, have slowed down for many of us as appraisers, it's a good opportunity to assess or kind of internally look at, if I had one of my reports submitted to the state, is there something that might be found deficient or wanting? And if so, there are lots of professionals out there that are willing and very competent at giving feedback as to, are you safely on the side of USPAP compliance, or are you right on the verge, or are you clearly missing the boat on a few things? If so, what are they, and how can you improve them? So just advice, I guess, for what it's worth, but would absolutely encourage appraisers to reach out and ask those questions themselves, as opposed to waiting for the investigator to be asking them those same questions.
Absolutely. And you've got some names up there that I have a lot of respect for, both of the Tim Anderson and Miss Diana Jacob. Diana, one of my favorite people on the planet, and Tim, he's okay. No, I like Tim too. He's a great guy. And they do both provide consulting service. I've done some of that in the past. And to Jeff's point, man, why not consult with someone that's well-versed in USPAP that can kind of, again, help you with that defensive driving. There's a couple of items there that I want to spend just a minute on. All right. One, you've got there, if we have time, I want to hear about the 15-year-old ceiling fan. That's intriguing me. But I want to skip down first. That second to the last bullet, where you said may confuse state requirements for supervised inspections with scope of work on GSE forms. I want you to expand on that a little bit, Jeff. I just had a call recently, and this was a gentleman that has multiple appraisers, multiple trainees, staff people. And he said, hey, one of my appraisers is going to be out of town for the Thanksgiving holidays, right? And we're getting orders in. Can I send somebody else out to do the inspection? And the problem is this appraiser is not the supervisor of the trainees. He's like, they're my trainees. Basically, I'm going to lend them out, right? And and still I'm holding their hand. But just because appraiser B is out of town, can we send out somebody else to do the inspection? I said no, but let's talk about that for a minute. Expand on that just a little bit as to what you mean by state requirements, or maybe even USPAP requirements, might be different than what GSEs say for someone doing the inspection.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the reasons I put it on here is we've seen that come up repeatedly. I know that states will vary from one to the next as to whether they have any requirements at all as to how many supervised inspections a trainee has to go on before the trainee can inspect by themselves, provided that that they're complying with scope of work, and usually that probably in all cases that the supervising appraiser believes the trainee is competent to be able to inspect that type of property on their own or without supervision. I see those state requirements vary. Utah says that on residential properties, you got to have a minimum of 35 supervised inspections with the supervisor and the trainee. Some states have no specified requirements, just that the supervisor has to know that the trainee's ready and competent to inspect the property on their own. I believe that Nevada has a 50 inspection minimum requirement. Florida, last I had looked, had a requirement of 6 months and X number of inspections. I have to look that up. I don't recall right off the top of my head. The point is that it varies from one state to the next. Many states aren't that prescriptive and don't say anything about a minimum number of inspections. But what we've seen is we'll get an experience review that'll come in from a trainee that's been failed. We'll ask the question, okay, who inspected the property? Okay, I did as the trainee. Okay, the supervisor signed on that left certification on a lending form as though they were the ones that inspected. And they're genuinely surprised to realize that, well, but I met my 35 minimum inspections that the state says I have to do, so therefore I can go out and inspect on my own. Yes, that's true, but you also can't lie on the certification about what you did and didn't do.
Wait a minute. This is important. Can you say what you just said again? You can't do what on the URAR?
Well, you can't lie on the certification about what you did. And on that URAR, whoever signs on the left certifies to having done a number of things, not just the inspection. But the inspecting the property is one of those things that they certify that they've done. And I've been surprised, and we've actually pushed out communications through a state newsletter, addressing that item specifically in the past. And it's not been as much of an issue in the last year or so. But sometimes when you have different requirements from a state agency to use PAP to what's in the hard-coded scope of work in lending assignments, it's created some confusion. And so this appraiser and trainee thought that they weren't in compliance with the state because they knew what the state rule was. They just were not fully appreciating what the certification in that they were signing said. And so we've ended up having to postpone or not grant experience in certain cases because they weren't in compliance with what they were certifying to their client that they had done.
In that specific case, so you had a trainee say, here's my log. Here's a couple of appraisals that I did the inspection on. You look at it and they're like, you didn't sign it as the appraiser doing the inspection. Somebody else did. And so granted, they didn't know any better, especially they were getting poor training. But what about that supervisory appraiser that signed on that left that you just said you can't lie, right? Did you guys take action again? I'm just curious. Did you call that supervisor and say, let's have a conversation? What happened with that, if you could tell us?
So in those situations, what we've generally done is referred the investigator over to the supervising appraiser. In our state, there are several different enforcement options. One is a citation letter or a letter of warning. Certainly that you can open an investigation and then decide, should more serious or severe action be taken. So we'll take into consideration, do they have a history of noncompliance or complaints in the past where they, were found to have had problems or not. We want there to be obviously compliance. We don't want to. On the other hand, we don't want to discourage people from taking on taking on trainees and mentoring, but they have to understand, what they're doing and they have to be in compliance. And so, yes, we do refer the investigator over, but the level of action taken, varied depending on a number of circumstances, specific to that appraisal.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good. And there needs to be action taken, even if it's just a letter, because you again don't lie, right? So guys, there's a right way of doing things and a wrong way of doing things, and we're big advocates for bringing in trainees. It can help you with your business in addition to helping the trainee, it's going to help the lenders. It's going to help the communities in which we provide service. It's a win-win-win all the way around. Now, I know a lot of people don't share that opinion, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, in my situation, the guy could send somebody else out and do it from a USPAP perspective. USPAP doesn't care. USPAP doesn't care that you even do an inspection, as long as you can get credible assignment results and you don't create a misleading report and you don't lie, like Jeff said. USPAP would be fine with that arrangement. The problem is the GSEs, Fannie Mae defines the appraiser as the person that does the inspection, the person that drives by the comparables, the person that does the analysis, the person that signs and delivers the report, or signs the report, sends the report in. Pretty much everything. And that needs to change, right? I've been kind of pleading with the GSEs for a while. Let's massage that. Let's change that out a little bit, right? Especially, we talk about appraisal modernization. Well, let's modernize that as well, right? But presently, this is what we're dealing with. So you cannot send anyone, a trainee even, out to look at a property, and then you sign on the left as though you went and looked at it if you didn't. Now, if you were there with them, fine. You were there. But you can't say, Jeff, go look at that property for me while I'm on vacation, and I'll sign on the left. As Jeff said most correctly and eloquently, you can't lie. You can't lie about it. So great stuff. Thank you with that, Jeff. All right, man, we're over time. Just super quick, tell me about the ceiling fan, and then if there's any other couple little tidbits you want to throw our way before we let you go, please feel free to do so. Jeff?
You bet. Yeah, we can wrap that up. In the vein of the conversation we were having of, kind of good bedside manner, I had a situation, and it's been a number of years now, but I was looking at a homeowner's there, walking me through, telling me the stuff that he's done, pointed out that he'd replaced this ceiling fan about 15 years ago, just wanted to make sure I knew about that. And you know what I did? I documented that. I even described in the report that certain things like light fixtures had been updated over time or whatever. I definitely didn't adjust for it, but that homeowner knew that I heard what he said, and that I would, you can describe a lot of stuff in the improvement section as far as things that have been done to the property. That doesn't mean that it automatically translates at some quantifiable amount, on a dollar adjustment basis or something. But when they feel heard and know that you listened to and paid attention to what was going on at the property, that goes a long way to reducing the likelihood of them feeling like this person was so bad that I need to turn them into the state. It was the main reason I had that there, Bryan. But I'm certainly not the best example in the world of always doing everything right. I mean, I strive to do things appropriately, but I found that if you can do things to avoid somebody being dissatisfied with the service that you're providing as an appraiser, provided that you're complying with our standards and requirements, that does as much as anything to minimize the likelihood of a complaint being filed. And so would probably just wrap up with that. Let me give you just one other quick note, Bryan. There are a couple of things that I think, and Jim, I appreciate that. I think you've got this up here, but I think are just worth mentioning, bullet pointed here. If you do get a complaint filed, be professional. That may not always be our first instinct. Sometimes we're frustrated, we're nervous, we're upset that we've already tried to address concerns and now they've turned us into the state anyway. Being professional in the way that you interact with especially with the division and with the board will go a long way. If you've got E&O insurance, notifying them so that you can have representation definitely helps. I've seen situations where sometimes an appraiser will bring an attorney in to represent them in a board hearing, and the attorney has no experience in administrative law. They're very good in the formal hearing before the judge, but I've seen that actually not be as helpful as someone who has experience with these kinds of enforcement matters in an administrative law situation. So a note there. Obviously a work file can be very helpful, can be your best friend or your worst enemy, depending on what you have in it and whether it supports what you've done or not. And so being attentive to those kinds of things, if there is a file that's complaint or a complaint that's filed, will make a big difference. I've seen some people not respond at all. That doesn't make it go away. I've seen people, lie outright to the investigator that then came out in the hearing, and that didn't go well. I've seen, and this isn't often, but there are things I've seen. I've seen them demean the investigator. I'm a designated appraiser with an institution. I've been doing this for 30 years. You don't know as much as I do. You're wrong about this. And it turned out that they had reporting violations that they weren't willing to own up to. So,
you've just been doing it the wrong way for 30 years, buddy. Right?
Yeah. How far back do we need to look to rectify this problem? I mean, that's not something you want to invite the investigator or the board to jump into if you can avoid it. So
right. So I took some notes here, and I know we got to wrap things up, but somebody gets a complaint today, right? They're the most defensive driver in their state when it comes to appraisals. However, they had somebody just so mad at them, they just blew their top, and they filed a complaint. What's the first thing this poor appraiser should do? Should they call their E&O? Should they call an attorney? Should they call a USPAT person? Should they handle it themselves? Should they not? Should they say, I had this happen one time. Well, this person that filed this complaint against me, I got a letter from my state regulatory board wanting my work file, wanting a copy of the appraisal report. But here's the thing, Bryan, the person that filed this complaint wasn't even my client, wasn't even an additional intended user. I mean, this is just a homeowner that's mad because they didn't get what they wanted. So because they're not my client, I don't think I'm going to send my report and work file to the state. What would your advice be to somebody like that?
Well, in my experience, that doesn't solve anything. It only makes it worse. The first thing that I would do is take a deep breath and just collect yourself if it's having an effect on you. I would definitely reach out to E&O, assuming that you have it. They will oftentimes be a very helpful resource in guiding. They can pair you with legal representation with those that work with these kinds of things if that becomes necessary. Responding in a timely way. And as a side note, Bryan, I'll throw in a quick plug for your sponsor for LIA. We work with them personally directly, and I have found that they're very helpful when it comes to guidance or direction, because they've got a vested interest in the most positive outcome for you as the appraiser as well. And so, they'll have good guidance. It's in their wheelhouse. Appraisers don't deal with complaints day in and day out, but insurance providers and their attorney partners do. And so you'll get much better advice from those that have a lot of experience with this than going to a Facebook forum or just guessing at what should I do in this situation, because like your experience or the one you just cited, yeah, they may not be a client, but that doesn't mean you can't respond to the state and hope for it to turn out well.
So a few things here. I'm right on the same page with Jeff Morley on this topic, right? Call your E&O. I've had people say, well, I don't really want to turn it into my E&O because my E&O might go up, and maybe I can handle this without letting them know. Yeah, maybe you can, maybe you can't. And how bad would this be if you're 6 months down the road and have to go to the hearing, and now you realize it's not going to go away, and you call your E&O and they say, we're not going to cover you now because you didn't notify us at the onset of this, right? So call your E&O, call LIA, call your E&O. Probably want to talk to an attorney, probably want to bring in a consultant. This is serious stuff that may have lasting impact on your career, guys. So you have to take this serious, and, nobody likes to be in that position. Jeff said, take a deep breath. You're not going to prison. Well, I mean, you could if you were doing really bad stuff, but hopefully you haven't done anything criminal, right? So you're going to get through it. There is life after a complaint, right? So don't do those things that Jeff submitted to you a moment ago. Don't do what this appraiser said. Well, I'm not even going to send the report and work file to the state agency, as that wasn't my client who filed the complaint. My response was, look, your state issued your license. guess what? Your state can take your license as well. Jeff Morley, thank you so much for spending time and hanging out. We're going to have to do this again. This is a hot topic. There's so much information. We couldn't cover it in a short podcast. We can't even cover everything in a 1-hour webinar. So I'm going to have to invite you back on if you're open to that. If somebody is watching and would like to reach out to you directly, maybe they have some questions or ideas, or maybe they want to engage your services, what's the best way for one of my viewers to reach out to Mr. Jeff Morley?
Well, appreciate it, Bryan. It's been a blast joining. Happy to connect anytime. I'm on LinkedIn, Jeff Morley, not many appraisers with that name. And email address, jmorley, MORLEY, at accuritY.com. And certainly happy to engage with anybody that may have questions or that I can be of service to.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Jim Morrison.
How you doing, Bryan?
What a great guest. I mean, he is he's top notch. He's got that great voice, just like his dad, right? And his knowledge. I mean, we could keep him here for hours. So put it on the to-do list. We got to have him back, right?
All right, yeah. And
so
it looks like we've got a lot of people in the comments saying that as well. So Jeff, we really appreciate it.
Good. So, are we going to do this again, Jim? Or are we gearing up to bring these appraisal report webinars back on a regular basis?
We're going to try. So put in the comments who you want us to interview too. So that might help us, in finding new guests as well.
Yeah. So if anybody watching would like to be a guest or have a suggestion for a guest, please reach out to Jim Morrison or myself or anybody over at the Appraiser eLearning team. We would love to have you on the program. Hey, just a shout out. I'm in my Nashville studio, not here very often, but this one was the first one we did in this new format. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it worked out well. Shout out to Jim McLeod, the Santa trees. If you're in the Nashville market, you probably can't see that too well. Reach out and go get you a Christmas tree over at Santa's Trees. They do a great job. I appreciate you being here. I hope you're doing well. I know business has been a little rocky. We're talking about maybe having somebody on to talk about an economic forecast for the upcoming year. So hopefully we can have them on really soon and get some good information and insight as to where this roller coaster ride is going. But I hope you are enjoying the holidays. You take some time out, you take a deep breath and relax. Everything's going to be okay. We're all in this together, and business will bounce back. That's one thing for sure. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it. Thank you for being here. You've been watching the Appraisal Report webinar brought to you by the fine folks over at Appraiser eLearning. Thank you, LI Administrators and Insurance, for your continued support. For Jim Morrison, for Jeff Morley, I'm your host, Bryan Reynolds. Until next time, happy appraising.